This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I'll be speaking with Ted Bola about the eternal oblivion theory of death. The conversation will begin when we return. The eternal oblivion theory of death is our subject, and I'm sort of taken aback by it because I only heard of this term, and I'm 60 years old, about a month or so ago, because it seemed to me, how is that a theory? It seems to me that's obviously what death is. But nonetheless, there's whole articles about it. People have written books about it, and Ted Bola, an artist who has written about it, will be joining me. So, Ted, before we get involved into the philosophy and stuff like that, I like to let my guests sort of define themselves. So, if you could give a little background about who you are, what you do, you have a YouTube channel, etc., and then we'll head into death.
Yeah, I'm an artist, and I do, I have local shows and things like that. But in my spare time, I just, philosophy is kind of a hobby of mine. I'm not trained as a philosopher. I'm just I just kind of dabble in it here and there. Um, yeah, so I just got, I had a family member of mine died, and this idea of eternal oblivion, kind of that it doesn't make sense, kind of came to mind whenever I really thought about death, uh, as a complete end, as some sort of eternal blankness after we die. So it was that experience, mostly after a relative of mine died, is what really put me on this path. Before that, I was a fan of Alan Watts, and so I was always interested in his ideas on death and things. But it his the way he spoke about it was confusing to me up until the point where it finally clicked. It isn't the and it's such a simple idea, but it's the language surrounding it is difficult, and so it doesn't click until it clicks. Um, yeah, so I'm not a philosopher or anything like that, but I do believe that, because uh, at some point in time, philosophers didn't really have to get a degree or anything like that. So in a way, I believe philosophy should be accessible to all people.
So, when we talk about death or life after death, we're not really talking about the body, because we know that left to its own devices, the body will rot, it'll be predated upon by bacteria, by insects, by larger predators. We're really talking about the self, what the brain creates. So, let me just start there. Are you one of these people who believes that the brain isn't the source of consciousness? Some people believe that it's more like a radio antenna that gets consciousness in, that we are all part of a giant ocean, where's a single wave that goes, that kind of thing?
I'm kind of agnostic, and as for the truth of what consciousness actually is, but for my YouTube channel and
And it's called
purposes,
Naturalist Ted. Naturalist
yes,
Ted with the T capitalized.
yes, it's kind of a play on words because it's suggesting that somebody is naturalized,
Mm.
when they adopt this
Naturalisted,
world.
yeah.
Yes, yes. So it's a strange play on words, but so I'm sorry. Oh yeah, I just kind of work within the naturalist worldview, um, and so I'm sorry. What was the main question there? Forgive
Uh,
me.
oh boy, now I don't remember. But uh, what 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 was your view on death? So you mentioned this person that had died, a member of your family or someone close to you. Was it a natural death? Were you there for the actual moment of death?
Not the actual moment of death, but everything before that. And so, yeah, I don't. I'm like I said, I'm agnostic when it comes to souls and all that. What I'm about to explain doesn't require souls or some sort of solipsism where we're all one mind, or like a Borg entity like from Star Trek. Nothing like that. It's derived from the idea that brains are responsible for consciousness, that processes in the brain are what produces consciousness.
Yeah,
So
I just watched a video of yours 30 minutes or so ago, why death will be followed by an experience. That seems, when you listen to it and when I watched it, you have not the classical view of reincarnation, but you seem to be leaning in that direction in that video. Am I wrong?
I see what you mean, and that is there is an error to reincarnation that that is definitely similar to what's known as generic subjective continuity, and
That would
which
some people call that the river of self. Are you familiar with that term?
no, I'm not actually.
Oh, okay. Well, we can
I
talk about
mean,
that later, but
yeah, that makes sense though. So I'm sorry, I lost my place there.
you were talking about well, I had mentioned the river of self. You were talking about conscious subjective experience.
Yeah. Uh, so when we die, if the brain is responsible for consciousness, then that would mean the complete end of that individual. And so I can run through a sort of short thought
Go
experiment
ahead.
here to. Okay, so if you imagine a universe that is completely devoid of all life, but then a single being comes to exist, and we can distill this down further from a single being to a single brain. And so, in this thought experiment, somehow this brain produces consciousness without a body. So there is consciousness. It doesn't matter if it's your brain or my brain. What's important is the existence of consciousness itself. And so if you don't exist in this scenario, you're not in some kind of black void. The only experience there is the experience being produced by this one and only brain. And so instead of the idea that just because you don't exist, you'll be in some kind of peaceful black void or oblivion, we should realize that one and only experience will be what is, or to use the David Benatar, the popular antinatalist, uses the word imposed a lot to mean that you didn't exist, but then a life was imposed on us. And so in that same way, in this thought experiment, you didn't exist, but yet this existence of this one and only experience in the universe causes that one and only experience to be imposed. And so that's the you, just as we are all, we all refer to ourselves as I, because, yeah, sorry.
No. I got that from some of your videos and something you'd written in the email, but I don't think we have to go even to the ends of the universe. And have you ever heard of the Boltzmann brain hypothesis? So that's what it sounds like. What you're talking about a little bit, that reality as we know it would be indistinguishable from a brain, the very last brain at the end of the universe, thinking back and filling things up. But I don't think you have to go to that sort of science fiction extreme. If we think, for example, and you can pick whatever animal, I'm going to go with an intelligent animal, elephants. If I think of all of the experiences that all of the elephants alive today have, and I think there are three major species: the African bush, the African savanna, and the Indian elephant. Or if I want to go a little further and talk about pachyderm experience, the mastodons, the mammoths, and all the precursors to elephants, as well as dead elephants that aren't alive now but are the three living species. I can say that the pachyderm or the elephantine experience is something that exists. But if I'm dead and I don't I'm not alive, there's no experience for me to have. It's as good as being at the end of that universe, because there's no way that I can, if you ask me what is the elephantine experience, whether it's an individual elephant or all the elephants in the elephant family that have ever lived, I will never know what that is. I can never experience that. So because there is nothing, because I don't have the ability to experience, it doesn't really matter what anyone else or anything else experiences. That's something that's forever beyond me. And even if I'm alive, I can't know the elephantine experience. I may know that an elephant has been shot and is dying. I may know that a baby elephant has just been killed by a tiger. But I can't know that in any real sense other than as an outside observer.
Correct. So that's where the word generic comes in generic subjective continuity, is because each brain that's currently alive right now is producing subjective experience right now. They're all producing consciousness. And so there's this generic self as a phenomenon in the universe that each brain is currently doing. And so for the same reason we all call ourselves I, and you call everybody else you. So there's this thing we all have in common. So if you were to distill everyone down, get rid of all their personal behaviors, personal memories, every single thing, you would arrive at this kind of baseline, just experience, just pure experience. And so every brain currently alive right now is responsible for kind of keeping this baseline experience existing in the universe right now. So after I die, this particular instance of experience will be gone. But we know as a matter of fact that there will be experience itself after I die. Not for me, I won't continue, but experience itself will exist in the universe after I die in all kinds of different contexts, in elephant brains and all the other brains that are going to be responsible for experience after I die. So it's not that I continue. There is no transmigration or anything like that. If I completely end, the question is, will there be experience in the universe after I die? It's the existence of experience itself in a generic kind of way to look at it.
Yeah, you wrote, and the title of that video that I mentioned, your end can only be followed by experience. Well, sure, but you don't even have to end. Right now, the Ted that is conversing with me via electronic media, if I went, 3 miles from where you lived, or I went to Australia and I found, a paramecium that was in the middle of splitting itself into two paramecia, that's an experience, but I wouldn't know of it. And so whether or not there are other experiences outside of you when you're alive, or before you were born, or when you are dead for 1,000 years, what does it really matter? I mean, it matters to the continent. I mean, if you look at it, think of existence as a series of overlapping films. Your film starts, maybe not even at your birth, because you may not be aware of it, because we lose a lot of information. In the first 2 or 3 years, the human brain isn't developed, so we might have 2 or 3 genuine recollections. And then you have maybe 60, 70, 80 years, and all of these things overlap. If you're married, you have a wife, or you have a brother, or you have a great Uncle Ted who comes over to visit every other Christmas. they're all going to have experiences, and you could, if you were to lay them on top of each other, it would be this giant stack of experiences that overlap. But your Uncle Ted's first love with the girl in 10th grade is something you're never going to be able to access. So I mean, what does that really have to do with who you are and what death means to you?
Well, I'm not trying to provide any consolation or hope or anything. Just I'm only concerned with explaining like this is what the conclusion we should arrive at. I'm not really concerned with, like I said, consoling anyone. It's more of here's the answer. Sorry that you won't continue, but you shouldn't anticipate eternal oblivion or nothingness after death. Instead, this is the logical conclusion. So it just as telling somebody, well, there's nothing after we die, isn't about consoling anyone. It's about just explaining, like, this is the answer.
But
So
how, but how, but how is that different from the Christian or the religious person or even the non-religious person who believes in whether it's the Christian God or whether it's simulation theory, and there's a giant computer programmer that has programmed us to have this conversation at this point in its experiment? It seems to me there's really not much difference between what you're stating and the religious belief. You're just leaving off the religious details.
Um, well, I don't know if you would really consider Buddhism as a religion, but it says, reincarnation happens after death. But most of them, a lot of Buddhists conclude that that's a bad thing. So it's not providing them with consolation. Whereas a religion like Christianity or others, it's providing an answer, but it's also providing consolation. And so one way or the other, it's about giving an answer, but some of them happen to have the byproduct of giving you consolation if it's a good thing that they
Well,
believe.
well, reincarnation. That's it. There are two ways to look at it. There's the physical aspect, but when most people talk about reincarnation, they're talking about a reincarnation of the self. That you, Ted, if you died in say 2050, in 2072, you may be reborn as another physical being, but you would still be the same soul. We have all been obviously reincarnated because every atom in our body at one point was inside of some ancient star. I may have been passed through the rear end of a Tyrannosaurus Rex's T-Rex shit. You may have been vomited up cow cud and all these kinds of things over and over. And these things come in. And this is where we get to the river of self. Now, I'll bring up two examples. You've probably heard of, the ship of Theseus thing, right? So for those who don't know, Theseus was a classical hero. He went on a boat, had his adventures, and the boat slowly wore down. And let's say there were 1,000 pieces to the boat. And as each piece wore down, a new piece was put in. And by the end of the trip, all 1,000 pieces of the boat had been totally replaced. Is that still the actual ship of Theseus that left? Now, if you're looking at the river of self view of it, you'd say, yeah, it would have to be, because of course, every 4.5 to 7 years or so, every atom in our body is totally replaced. We're patterns. On the other hand, someone said, well, but suppose they had behind them taken along on a tugboat or something, the original pieces they discarded. And when they got back to port, they put together the original ship of Theseus, and now you have the ship of Theseus that ended the journey and the one that began the journey, which is the real ship of Theseus. But I don't think you can do that when we're talking about consciousness, and that's when we talk about reincarnation. They're talking about the permanence of that soul. Another example you probably heard of too is the Star Trek transporter hypothesis. That you atoms are all split apart down to the last quark or whatever subquantum thing might be below that, and if I'm up on the moon, they can beam you down to Earth and reassemble you there. But I would argue, I'm one of those people that would argue that that's death because you have severed the river of life. Let's say, think of a river that flows in a desert. It flows and it has the monsoons in spring, and the river flows and flows, and then for the next 7 months it's dry. The river is not there. Now you still have the river bed, but the river doesn't exist for 7 months. The next year's monsoon comes along and that fills you up. So where do you stand on this idea, though, of needing a continuous self? Or would you say that if you could produce someone in a Star Trek transporter and make a copy of yourself, which one is you?
Mm-hmm. See, I think it comes back to what do we define as ourselves? Are you, like you said, the self that you were when you were very young, or are you the self that you are now? So Tom Clark, in his essay Death, Nothingness, and Subjectivity, he does this thought experiment where there's a surgery that one person goes on to this, it's like a futuristic surgery. A person goes on to this operation table, and the surgeons slowly make changes until the point where it completely, like the ship of Theseus. This person is completely changed, yet somehow subjective experience is maintained. So this person went under and then wakes up as a completely different person who you can't really say was the original person. So the original person, as Tom Clark puts it, has died by transformation, death by transformation. And so this new subjectivity wakes up with all these new memories and stuff. But the thing to notice is there was no experienced gap, an experience of nothingness. Just like every night whenever you go to sleep, you don't experience the periods of time you're unconscious. It's unconsciousness is like a proverbial time machine. It's just skipped over. And so from the perspective of the person that went to sleep, they woke up, but there's no memories. There's no continuity of that person that went to sleep. And I'm just pointing out, like, this is a fact. This would be what happens. Just like you wake up in the morning and you didn't experience, let's say you, while you were asleep, you got amnesia, but you wake up, there's a continuity of experience. You didn't experience the absence of experience while you were unconscious. So you wake up as this version of you that has no prior memories or anything because you have amnesia now. There's still a continuity of experience in these examples. So we're saying the same thing would happen after death. Like in my empty universe thought experiment, if you're the only being in the universe, and then you die, and then sometime later another being comes to exist in the universe, there would be no experienced nothingness in between those two instances of experience coming to occur in the universe. There would just be experience and then experience. From the point of view of experience itself, there's no black void in between its own lack of existing.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying there, but for example, just to use a famous person, George Washington. George Washington doesn't exist. As far as we know, George Washington has not had subjective experience or even objective experience for at least 2+ centuries. Well, I don't know the exact date he died, but from then, that was it. No matter how famous, no matter how good, no matter how evil, Genghis Khan does not exist in our world. He's a historical figure, and maybe they'll dig up his corpse one day, but he doesn't have any experience as far as we know. And getting back to what you were saying about some of those examples. So, there have been cases where someone has been in a great trauma. They were in a building explosion and they walk out dazed, and when they recover, they're totally different. Or they have a tumor in their head, and one day they have an aneurysm, or something happens because of the tumor, and they don't remember who they are. Now they've had the river of self, physically speaking, but the brain is malfunctioning some way. Or I guess in more extreme cases during the Cold War, if someone was captured and tortured and put through some brainwashing techniques like the film The Manchurian Candidate, you could hypothetically, if not really, change the person by the use of drugs and manipulation of some sort. But that would still be the same essential person. They may not recognize themselves. If for example, imagine you woke up one day from your bed and you didn't know where you were. For example, have you ever seen the 1967 British television show The Prisoner?
I haven't.
I would suggest you watching it. It's to me one of the great shows. Patrick McGowan. But suppose a guy wakes up who's a spy. He's been drugged, and he wakes up in this village where there's no one around, and he's only known by as number 6. Everyone has numbers in this village, up to several hundred. Now we know he has a past. We don't know of his past. He presumably knows of his past. He seems to have a past because the people who run the village are trying to get the past out of him. But for all intents and purposes, he's a new person. He's someone who was just born when he woke up that moment in the village. But all of the atoms are intact. So when we're talking about the self, ultimately we're really talking not about our physical beings. We're talking about the brain or the mind that is created by the brain. You don't have any problem saying that the brain creates the mind, that the mind, what we call it, is 100% created by the brain. You would agree with that?
I think that's highly likely. Again, I'm agnostic when it comes to that. As naturalists.
Well, let me ask you: if you're agnostic, then what else could it be? We've talked about like the brain as the receiver. What else other than the brain could create Ted Bolha?
Naturalists are agnostic for this, because it is possible that one day science might reveal that panpsychism is actually true, or that it could be, no matter how implausible, that solipsism is true. Like right now, maybe you're actually the only mind that actually exists, or maybe I am, and so on and so forth. Or maybe the whole minds as receivers thing is true, but it seems science currently seems to reveal that brains are responsible for consciousness, or at least the consciousness depends on a brain to create this locus of experience, this center of experience.
Yeah. Well, when we talk about panpsychism, and for those who might not know, that's the idea that everything in the known cosmos, at least, has some form of experience, some form of consciousness, however rudimentary. A volcanic rock sitting on the top of a volcano in Hawaii might have some rudimentary consciousness. A yeast cell might have some rudimentary consciousness. But we can both agree that neither the volcanic rock nor the yeast cell is going to be able to do an algebraic equation, whereas you and I probably took that in junior high school at least.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
there are differences in levels of magnitude when we're talking about consciousness. Certainly the enlightened Buddha, certainly a nuclear physicist, certainly a Leonardo da Vinci may not be worth more from the cosmic perspective, but we in our biases as human beings could say, well, I can appreciate Leonardo da Vinci's ideas more than I can the beauty, let's say, of volcanic rock.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I operate in the worldview that brains are responsible for consciousness. But what I'm I'm an advocate for generic subjective continuity. Uh, it doesn't require that brains are responsible for consciousness. We could be. It's possible that we could be souls in bodies, and I explained this elsewhere, that if we are souls inside bodies, but are you familiar with annihilationism in
Yeah, that's sort of the religious version of what we're talking about. That
yeah,
Christ comes, those who are damned are totally wiped. You know,
yeah,
the chalkboard is wiped clean.
they cease to exist. And so in that worldview, generic subjective continuity would still be true, because after a soul is annihilated, then there's, like I said, there's still experience via other souls in the universe. And so GSC would occur at the end of that individual's life. So it doesn't really matter what is responsible for consciousness. It applies if AI somehow becomes conscious. It applies no matter what's actually responsible for it, if panpsychism is true. Or, another thing is, all religions, I'm pretty sure, would admit that we go conscious every night when we go to sleep. I don't think they'd have a problem with that idea that we all go completely unconscious at some point while we're asleep, or if we take a hit to the head, or if we're administered anesthesia. And so in those moments as well, GSC occurs as well. So every night when you go to sleep, there's still experience out in the world, out in the universe. And so you're unconscious, but whenever you go to sleep, there isn't, like I said earlier, there isn't some kind of experienced gap or non-experience, that this kind of black void idea. There is experience. It's just going on. Other brains are doing it, and so you wake up and you have no recollection of these other experiences because you're not connected to those other brains. Mm-hmm. You wake up and you don't say, "Oh, that was weird being a zebra in Africa last night." You would have no connection, just as I'm not connected to your brain. I have no idea what it's like to be you right now. So.
So I wanted to get back to, because you brought up the idea of a soul. Now let me just ask you: were you raised in any particular religion, and if so, which one?
Catholic.
Roman Catholic. Because I was raised as a Lutheran, and I've actually done a few religious shows recently. The reason I say that is because in Lutheranism, at least, which is a Protestant denomination of Christianity, in Lutheranism, the soul is not necessarily equated with the consciousness. The soul is something deeper, more primal. This is why especially with Roman Catholics, when they talk about ensoulment of the fetus, in talking about abortion rights, they're not talking about the fetus necessarily being a conscious being, although some people will talk about that in a scientific way. They're talking about the moment that the sperm and the egg come together, ensoulment happens, and obviously that those two become one cell, doesn't have the conscious experience of the being it will become if it becomes born. So to me, I don't know if talking about souls within a body, or souls, what was the term you had, souls within, I think you said body, that seems to me something different than our notion of consciousness. Do you see any difference between the notion of a soul, which is more or less a religious, emotional thing, versus the consciousness, which is just the rational thought processes that the brain carries out for good or ill?
Oh yeah, definitely a very big difference. But like you said, there are, depending on which church you go to or which religious person you ask, everyone has a different idea of what soul means. I've heard it explained as being the breath of life.
Well, and in the Bible, God breathes into Adam. I think first, he makes the form, and then that's probably the best way to say it. That the soul, there's something in the religious mind that the soul is something more essential even than living. I guess even more than the body, because the soul is the thing that the body is almost just the thing that the soul drags around in a religious context.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um,
Uh,
yeah, go ahead.
oh no, I was I was just agreeing.
Um, so so you do believe then that nothingness, and I think in my email I said it would be the absence of even absence, because when people think of nothingness, which is difficult, people have a hard time talking about infinity as well. These sort of nebulous contexts. The number zero is also something that gives people a lot of problems. But uh, blackness Blackness isn't nothingness. Blackness is blackness. Silence is silence. It's not nothingness. Nothingness is something total, and it's very difficult. And people do use the what sensations did you have before you were born? I can't think of what life in 1850, much less 1950. I was born in 1965. Those two dates, I can look in the case of 1950 at old TV shows, at documentaries or whatnot, and I can get a sense of 1950, but I don't have any way of experiencing it. And short of time travel into the past, which I don't think is something that is probably feasible, but I could be wrong. There's no way anyone can know that. So, how do you define nothingness? Because I just said the absence of even absence. How do you define nothingness?
Well, I think it's a word that shouldn't really exist. Nothing. If we did away with the word nothing completely, we could still get by. Uh, we could just say there isn't anything there, or there isn't anything in the room, or there isn't anything in the box. We don't have to say that there is nothing in the box. You know, there's ways around it. It's the whole concept of when we try to think what is nothing. It brings to mind, for some reason, I don't know why, but whenever we think of nothingness, people go straight to a black void, a silent black void, and that to me is kind of strange. I think it has something to do with whenever we're going to sleep, all the lights are off and it's quiet, and so we kind of carry that with us. There's this kind of illusion that happens that that's what it's like. But as you pointed out, for there to be any quality after death that you personally experience, you continue into this experience of silence, blackness, just this peace. It's often described as peaceful. All of these are qualities. And so for there to be any qualities, that's an experience after death. So,
Well, might the reason for that, and I'm just spitballing here, might the reason for that be that when one is a fetus, even though we don't have any, even though there's really no way to prove that anyone has fetal memories, I've known a few people who claim to have had it, but uh, if there was such a thing, even if we forget it later, the first experiences that we would have would be in total darkness because we're in the womb. Now, maybe we hear a bit of the heartbeat or something, so there might not be total silence. But I'm wondering if the difficulty of understanding nothingness is related to the human tendency to try to see things circularly, in cycles, and that if we came from the blackness of the womb, and then imagine there was a comedian who did a thing where you're coming into the world, and your face is all distorted, and you're being pushed out, it's probably an exceedingly traumatic experience for the infant, but then we have, and maybe that's why we have the fear, because if our first impression of existence is blackness, and then we have this horrible forcing out into the sound and the sights and the everything of living. Maybe that's why we fear death so much, is we think the exact opposite is going to happen, that death will be as traumatic and painful as birth is, and then blank, we're back into the, that we've done nothing with our lives except gone in a circle. I'm just wondering, have you ever had that thought?
That's very interesting. The idea of this blackness coming from the contrast, what we can only imagine as being the contrast to, we got everything happening, to what we call nothing, and so we come to this conclusion that the only thing that can be the opposite of this is, this eternal oblivion, a black void, like you said. So our eyes are taking in light and everything, and so the opposite of that is complete darkness. Yeah, that's very interesting. I like that.
So you did a video call that basically asked, why is there something rather than nothing? What was your conclusion? What in that video?
So this is something it's kind of I guess a pet theory I have. I call it the law of somethingness, and I personally, I keep coming back to this, although I could definitely be wrong, that everything in the universe is kind of forced into existence by the fact that nothing cannot be. Like, nothing isn't something that can be, and if it can be, then that's something. And so only something or somethingness is capable of being. And I believe this fact that nothing is what kind of forced everything to exist. And I also believe that this eventually led to consciousness coming to exist. So this law would fill up all voids. Any idea that any would-be voids is actually eventually filled up by somethingness, as opposed to nothing, because, like I said, there can't be nothing. It's a law of nature that nothing cannot exist. If it does, then that makes it something.
Are you familiar with the block universe theory?
Yeah.
So for those who don't know, the block universe theory is the idea that the cosmos, even the cosmos beyond our visible cosmos, that everything, however infinitely far away in time or space, is basically like, think of it like a giant square, and that time is an illusion, and that in essence no one ever dies because no one's ever really born. This was all created at once, and there still is the Genghis Khan timeline, that goes from here, squiggle, to there, and this block might be infinitely large, but in that scenario, there's really no birth, there's no death. It's just because you are always there. Let's say I was born in 1965. Let's say I'm lucky and I live to be 100 and I die in 2065. From 1965 to 2065, Dan Schneider has always been. He always will be, but I'm now experiencing this, and well, I got a couple of things there, but what is your thought on that, pro or con, that theory?
Pro or con?
Because if it's true, if the block universe theory is true, then there is nothing, there is no nothingness. Everything is, and it is eternal. It's just all an illusion.
Yeah, only in that scenario, only something exists. As far as pro and con, do you mean good and bad, like a value judgment?
Yeah, because I'm not big on the idea of determinism, and that's probably a whole nother show talking about that kind of thing. I think that we all have free will. I think that human beings are conscious and capable. We're not philosophical zombies. We are engaged actors, but that's totally out the window if we live in a block universe. Then we're just basically a bunch of Pinocchios.
So I try to stay away from placing value judgments on things like this. But my instinct would, just like Buddhists don't really like the idea of eternal reincarnation, it doesn't sound so great to me that, after I die, that I could relive this life over again infinitely, or that in GSC or in the block universe, eternalism, eventually the life of some terrible life is going to come after this one. That sounds like hell. So GSC kind of reveals this. Tom and I sometimes talk about how should we even bother telling people this, because it can cause kind of a emotional, kind of an existential crisis for some people.
So have you ever seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life?
Yes, I love that.
So it starts off and then ends up, there's an angel that comes down to Earth and helps Jimmy Stewart's character, and the angel is seen as a twinkling star or something up in the sky. One of the more interesting corollaries, although I don't believe it, but to the block universe thing is that, getting back to sort of ensoulment, we are not physical beings. We're not even patterns, and I don't know if there's a formal term for it. I've always called it the roller coaster theory, that let's say we have the Genghis Khan experience and it's over here, and then over here there's the Ted Bolha experience, and then there's the Dan Schneider experience, and it starts at our births or maybe conception and it ends at our deaths. That if we are not conscious, active beings, and we're just souls, well, once that the me that's talking to you now is this soul that is experiencing the Dan Schneider experience, which is temporarily overlapping with the Ted Bolha experience, and once I'm dead, I could maybe go in and live the Ted Bolha roller coaster and be, speaking that. And there's also another theory, I forget what it's called, where you experience everything. I think it was from a short story called The Egg, about 20 years ago. Yeah, it's something similar to that. But again, all of these things seem to me to be so ornate. This, not that I believe that everything has to be simple, but these kinds of thoughts are so extravagant that it just doesn't make sense to me. All of these kinds of, it's just unnecessary.
I have always tried to figure out ways to put generic subjective continuity very succinctly. What I've come to, the most succinct way I can put it that conveys this idea, but requires a lot of insight from the person to understand it, and that this phrase would be only experience is what's experienced. And so we only ever experience experience. And this is true before we are born and after we die, and while we're unconscious during our lives. So you can't have an experience of no experience. Even after you die, even after you cease to exist, experience will still be experienced. One experience or another. There's no escaping it.
Yeah, but it's sort of like saying that you can only live life while you're living. Yeah, I mean that's sort of solipsistic. And one of the things that I think that happens, and this is me as a writer speaking, is that there's a thing called the failure of language, that ultimately all language is... Hold on one second, my cat keeps banging on the door. Would you stop it, Petula? Come on, get in. You want in? Ay. She's just banging on the door. Now where was I here? What was I just saying? Well, there it goes.
You're good.
What was it? I'm sorry, what?
You were talking. Oh, it could all be solipsistic. And about my comments on only experiences what's experienced.
Yeah, and life is only being lived. But see, you made me forget, you bad girl. Uh, well, let's. Oh, the failure of language. Yeah, that everything is solipsistic, and so um, I think one of the things that I find when people talk about death generally, or is that there's always that failure of language because we have to refer to an absence, and to refer to an absence, we use a word like absence, or we use a word like nothingness, and the ideation of those very terms cannot be nothing. So if you go in thinking that language is all, like I said, the failure of language is that everything it's referential and it's constantly going in these circles. And I think people sometimes mistake that failure of language for a failure of, here she is, for a failure of, of, of thought. And so I think you can have a good or bad idea about death, but I don't think necessarily the language will reflect it because language is ultimately limited. And we're talking about concepts that are, by definition, infinite, by definition, outside the ability to experience it. Harry Houdini, the famous magician, said he was going to come back from death, and if anyone would be able to find a loophole, he probably would be the person. But he hasn't ever returned, and so it seems to me that there always is that sort of gap between what we can express and what we can experience, and one that they're correlated, but they're not necessarily too intimately tied together. Am I making any sense?
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, language depends on context and it depends on prior understanding, things like that. Something to go back to the trying to make it more simplistic. Another way to look at it, as Alan Watts put it, you are the universe experiencing itself. Mm-hmm. Similar to what Carl Sagan said, we are a way for the universe to know itself. And so if you adopt that worldview, then we are all just basically like a set of eyes that the universe has. Like you can look at yourself as one of the universe's eyes and eyeballs, you know. So if we are the universe experience in itself, then that immediately should tell a person, well, after this eye closes, there are still the true me, which would be the universe, is still going to have plenty of eyes open. They open and close all the time. So that's kind of a esoteric way of looking at it, you know, like similar to are you familiar with the artist Alex Gray?
No.
He did the Tool album artwork, the band Tool.
I know, I've heard of Tool, but I can't visualize it. But
very psychedelic. But Alan Watts kind of adopted this worldview that we are actually the universe experiencing itself in kind of this divided way. Like you're just another variation on a theme, basically, like the eyeball analogy that I use. So that's one way to look at it, either metaphorically or you could adopt that worldview that you are the universe experience. So either way, we are all constructed of atoms. You know, there isn't, you know, the atoms on this table here are basically the same kind of atoms that I have that construct me. So in a way, we're all just atoms. Everything is atoms that's floating in this black void that, you know, some of them are forming objects and stuff, but it's all really just a sea of atoms.
Well, Emerson, I think it was Ralph Waldo Emerson, I think it's in Walden, he has a famous line talking about, I am become a transparent eyeball. All around me courses through me. While it's true, and I believe that, yeah, obviously you and I are both infinitesimally small bits of the cosmos, and with different points of view on it. That doesn't mean, though, that we are so intimately tied that we don't have the sense of self. When Emerson does talk about being a transparent eyeball, he's talking about being able to step back from his own subjective experience into something deeper. Almost as if, let's say, if we think of life as a movie, he's a character popping out off the film screen to look at himself and everything going around. So I think we can be, quote unquote, at one with the cosmos in that sense that a lot of Buddhists and other more Eastern philosophies espouse. But I think we also are individuals selves. There is going to be a part of you that will never be reproducible if even if you could rerun the experiment of this cosmos all over again. Ray Kurzweil, the guy who runs for Google, who I think is a big quack, he looks at artificial intelligence as being able to resurrect people, or his father. But there's no way, because there's no way we could ever know every single thing that ever happened to you. And even if we knew every subjective or objective fact and thing that happened in precise detail, there is still going to be the fact that the atoms that compose you are something different. So you are both a part of the cosmos, but you are singularly Ted Bolha, and there never was a Ted Bolha before. There will never be a Ted Bolha. Yes, someone might have that name, but the Ted Bolha that you are, there will never be that same Ted Bolha. And it seems to me some people just don't seem to want to take sort of responsibility for their own person. And I think this is one of the things that is so dangerous about religion that promises a great afterlife is that you could just float around in life. You could be evil. You could do wicked things. You could just waste your time, but somehow it's all going to be wiped clean. I don't know. It seems to me that the reason that people don't want to accept death as nothingness is almost because of a social prohibition against it, not because you'd be an atheist or an agnostic, but because you would be rejecting the reality that most people want to buy into, because it feels good to believe that you're going to be rewarded. It feels good to think that even if you put aside heaven and hell conceptions, that something of you lives on. Whereas for me, I think that, it's just a brute fact. There's the just because thing. Ultimately, if we go down the elephants or the turtles on the turtles back, in the base elemental reality, why the question why for anything becomes sort of meaningless. And in fact, if you ever watched that Prisoner show I told you about, there's a great episode called The General about this room-sized computer from the 1960s that is defeated. It's the enemy of the one episode. It's defeated because the hero types in the one question it can't answer, WHY, question mark, why. And I don't know, maybe I'm just ranting here, but it seems to me that's one of the reasons that people have such a hard time with death, is that there's this social inability to comprehend one's finity.
That episode you just mentioned about asking the computer, who's like God, why? That's very interesting, because
1967 that show aired.
Whenever I was very young, I actually took a very potent hallucinogen, and I didn't know what it was at the time. I was just told I'd like it, but I was very young. And so one of the experiences I had while on this is I went to sleep, while I was still having the drug was still working. I went to sleep and everything faded to black, and I felt my own presence in this state, and slowly this void lit up, and there was this fire everywhere, and it was just like fire and then a black void above me. And I looked up, and something told me to ask the question why. I just asked why. And then there was this strange voice, kind of a muffled, very masculine voice, said, "The boredom of nothingness." And I was just like, to me, that made a lot of sense. I was like, oh, okay, because nothing would be too boring, and so there must be something. I was about 13 or 14.
But how could nothing be boring? Because you
Hey.
see, there's the failure of language again.
Yes, yes, yes. So it was just this experience that just you reminded me of it when you brought. I gotta see that. I gotta watch that. But yeah, it's maybe it was just my subconscious trying to make sense of things. But it's so funny that like whenever you go into this real deep place in your life, and the ultimate question is always why. Why is there something rather than nothing? We always go back to that. It's very interesting. So
Go ahead.
there was something else I wanted to point out is that, like I said earlier, generic subjective continuity doesn't provide any consolation, and actually, I have spoken to some people. They say they wish they never heard of it because they then realize shortly after understanding it that after this life could come the worst possible life in the universe. The next experience could be that of a chicken being held in a factory farm, or a zebra being torn to shreds by a crocodile. Just all these, there's just so many terrible experiences going on right now in the universe. Who knows where else? And so I kind of got mixed up in, I'm pretty involved in the anti-natalist community, where, are you familiar with anti-natalism? David Bennett?
Politically, I've heard the term natalism, but this sounds more philosophical.
Anti-natalism is the idea that it is wrong to cause sentient life to exist, to bring more being into existence. But there's this specific part, the popular South African philosopher David Benatar, he wrote a book called Better Never to Have Been. And this idea that it can be better to not exist clashes with generic subjective continuity, and the idea that there cannot be a better if you don't exist. If I never came to exist, for it to be better, I would have to exist in some metaphysical place where I am experiencing said better. Without that, you can't say that it's better to not exist.
Yeah, that seems to me like the argument, because depending on how interbred we are, it's believed that there have been 40 to maybe 120 billion Homo sapiens. Forget about the Neanderthals and other earlier humans, but about 40 to 120 billion Homo sapiens that have ever existed. Yet there is obviously, if not a total infinite, a near infinite amount of human beings that could have existed. To say that they had it better off or whatnot is not even just, it's absurdism. I mean, it's an absurd thing to try to even assert, because how can you know? How can you know what would have been? If the sperm next to me had made it to my mother's egg just half a second before I did, that child that was born would not be me. It would be someone quite similar to me in many ways, certainly genetically, but would it have had the same experiences? Probably not. So yeah, that's one of those things that I don't know. It seems one of those things where it sounds like important or whatnot, but when you really examine it, it falls apart.
Yeah. What is often called a deity. Benatar will typically say, well, I don't mean that it would be better for that person, literally for that person, like there's some kind of experience of appreciating not existing. But what's very important is that, excuse me, almost all of the anti-natalists that you would meet online or out in the world, your everyday anti-natalist takes better never to have been literally, and so their view is, I wish I were never born, because that would be better. And you'll find things like memes and people saying like the peacefulness of not existing, and
Again,
pure.
failure of language, because if you're not existing, there's no such thing as peace.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
So I have made many videos on my channel refuting this idea that it's better to not exist through
um,
what.
are you familiar with the Oriental concept of mu or wu?
Uh, woo wee?
No,
Like,
no, 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 no. There's a Japanese filmmaker, a great one named Yasujiro Ozu. He's made a number of great films, but one of his films called Tokyo Story or Tokyo Monogatari is usually in the top 10 or top 20 of films of all time by most critics. And he had this, and on his gravestone, he died. He was born, I think, in 1903, died in 1963, and on his gravestone, there's the image for the Japanese word or symbol mu, and in China it's called wu, which is basically the idea that, getting back to what I earlier said about the womb, is that you come from nothing and you end in nothing. And I've always found that to be, you know, what death could only be. I was just wondered if you had heard of that, but um, just
the
oh, go ahead.
something
Go ahead.
something that another thing Alan once said was, we don't come into the world, we came out of the world. And so this idea that we come from nothing and return to nothing doesn't really hold, because there was something before we existed, and there will be something after we no longer exist. And you can't just pop out of nothing. The parts that construct you already existed. So there was a world before you. And so it's not really right to say that we come from nothing. We came from what already existed.
Well, this is why I've never been. I've always thought the failure of the Big Bang Theory is that when they talk about the Big Bang Theory, almost 14 billion years ago, coming from nothing, well, they always caveat and say, well, there was potentiality. Well, if there's potentiality, that's not nothing. So you've already undercut what you're stating. And now I'm talking on a cosmic scale rather than on an individual scale. But just one final thing before I just close with you. So we've talked about nothingness. We've talked about life or death, possibly. I'm of the belief that life has no purpose, and furthermore, I don't think life or existence, because existence can include that volcanic rock I mentioned earlier in the show, that exists even though it's not alive, but that it can have no purpose, and that if one were to say that life or existence is because of something, if there is any kind of purpose, I think it's that individual actors, you, me, those who existed and are now dead, those who will be, and those who are currently here along with us on this planet, and any other alien life forms, any other artificial intelligences, or the intelligent whales or apes or elephants, that it is that we have the ability to create meaning. Meaning isn't just something that, Ted Bolha, his purpose on life is to do A, B, and C. Once he's done that, who cares whether he lives or dies? You have the superpower, if you will, to say, this is what my life is going to be. If you're making art, if you're making a video, if you're having an argument with your wife or your kid about something, you have the ability to take control of that situation to a high degree, that we're not just these philosophical zombies. What is your take on the meaning or the purpose of life do you think that there can be, or that, what is your take on that?
Well, if we go, if you look at it from the perspective of a religious person and they say, well, God gives me meaning, then you have to ask where did God get that meaning that he assigned you? And so everything eventually, if you keep going back, becomes arbitrary. Uh, God says, well, I'm just going to give you this arbitrary meaning, but why? So ultimately, even in a religious worldview, I see everything as arbitrary and absurd. Uh, so I would agree with you that I have to give myself meaning, but I'm also a determinist. So I think I am kind of, uh, there's these.
Well, how do you reconcile that? How a determinist in what sense? Are you a hard determinist, a soft determinist?
I think I'd be a hard determinist because my thoughts are kind of just coming to mind. They come from unconscious processes, and I become conscious of them. So I'm dictated by whatever unconscious processes bring things to mind. I don't know what I'm going to be thinking in an hour. I don't know my next thought in 40 seconds from now. I'm not responsible for creating those thoughts or my wants. And so these wants come from, like I said, unconscious processes. If I were in charge of deciding which wants that I want, I would have to want a want. And so you would have to ask, well, why do I want that one? Because, there's this infinite regress of like every want requiring you to want it.
But if everything
And
is determined, then you're basically arguing for a determiner or a god, because ultimately someone is making a choice. Whether I mean, there's a famous poem by Robert Frost, "The Road Not Taken." I came upon a path that split in the woods. Now the idea is that you're either going left or you're going right, but literally there's an infinite amount of choices that the experience of the poem could do. Just for the artistic sense of making a statement, it's reductively brought down to just going left or right. But you could go straight into the next tree. You could climb that tree. You could look up at the bird. You could go backwards. You could want to vomit and vomit right there. So I'm just wondering, when you're calling yourself a determinist, that seems to be undercutting a lot of the things that you've said in this hour.
well, I always just point out that I don't decide the thing that I want. I might make a choice between A or B, but if you keep if you analyze what made me choose B, what made me decide to get mushrooms on my pizza is because I want mushrooms. Why do I want mushrooms? Because I like the way they taste. Why do I like the way they taste? Well, that's just my taste buds, and I didn't decide that I would, when before I was born, I didn't say, hey, give me some taste buds that are going to enjoy mushrooms. And so for me to want something requires there to be a prior cause that wasn't up to me, that something that is pushing me that isn't me. Because if I am in charge of my wants, then that would require me to exist, long before I existed. Our wants are imposed upon us, and the biggest one is to survive and pursue pleasure and happiness and avoid pain. And so these things are, like I said, they're imposed on us. Um, I personally, I don't see how that clashes with anything about GSC.
Yeah, well,
Or my,
that's ultimately that's something that's another whole show. I just find it interesting that you would state that, because I would have thought you would have been at the opposite end. But nonetheless, I want to thank you for spending an hour or more talking about it. Before we go, I will link to Naturalisted, your YouTube channel below here for anyone who wants to see any of your videos or any other thoughts. Um, are you working on any kind of a book or anything? What project are you doing next?
Yeah, I'm currently working on a book. I'm editing it right now, so I hope to have it out early next year. I'm self-publishing it just because I don't want to go through the gatekeepers of, somebody might or might not. I just don't want to have to keep. But yeah, I'm working on that with Tom Clark is actually helping me along with that, and the working title is Death and Nothingness. I believe well, that's pretty much it, and why atheists uh, shouldn't believe in, or no, what atheists need to know about death and nothing. So that's the working title. It's going to be around 100 pages long, just like a pretty thin book, something short and easy.
Well, again, I want to thank you for spending time speaking with me, Ted Bola, and you have a good day.
You too, Dan.